Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 674 of People Behind the Science. Today, we are excited to be resharing our conversation with Dr. Madhur Anand, originally released on July 25th of 2016. Listeners, Madhur is an ecologist who studies the impacts of global ecological changes on ecosystems. In her work, she examines how things like climate change, pollution, invasive species, and land use changes affect biodiversity, ecosystem services, ecosystem functioning, and ecosystem stability. And Madhur's research has important implications for conservation, policy, sustainability, and beyond. So listeners, get ready to learn more and get inspired by Madhur in this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to introduce you all to Madhur Anand. So, Madhur, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
I am great, and thank you for having me.
Wonderful. We are delighted to have you with us. But I'm going to start by giving our listeners just a little bit of background here. So listeners, Madhur is a professor in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of Guelph. She received her bachelor's and PhD from Western University and went on to conduct postdoctoral research at the University of Trieste, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Utrecht University, and also the University of New Mexico. Madhur also served on the faculty at Laurentian University before accepting a position at the University of Guelph, where she is today. Now, Madhur is the recipient of many awards and honors, including Premier's Research Excellence Award, 2 Canada Research Chairs, Western University's Young Alumni Award of Merit, the Indo-Canada Chamber of Commerce Female Professional of the Year Award, and she was also named a Young Scientist of the World Economic Forum. Now, in addition to the accolades she has received for her science, Madhur is also an accomplished poet. So her first book of poems, A New Index for Predicting Catastrophes, was published in 2015 and nominated for a Trillium Book Award for Poetry in 2016. Now, listeners, Madhur is here with us today to tell us about her experiences in life and science and to share her stories. So today we want to get to know you, Madhur, both as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do with your time when you're not busy doing science?
Well, I like to do lots of things when I'm not doing science. I love to read. I love to cook. I love to drink wine. Sometimes that happens with the science, but often not. Mm-hmm. I like to spend time with my family. I like to watch movies. Every week we do a family movie night. And because my children are young, it's often a children's movie, but I love watching all those children's films. So all those nice things, but probably most significantly, I write poetry when I'm not doing science. So as you've mentioned, I published my first book of poems last year, which some of you may be interested in checking out because it does actually combine all of those interests that I mentioned and also my science together.
Fantastic. Well, wonderful to hear more about your life outside of science. It sounds like you have quite a bit to keep you busy, and I'm fascinated by this poetry of yours. So can you tell us how you got into poetry?
Well, poetry just kind of found me, I feel. So I wrote my very first poem in the very last year of writing up my PhD thesis in theoretical ecology. And I can't tell you exactly why I started at that point, but I suspect it had to do with spending lots of time alone, kind of being in my head a lot with a theory that I was studying. And who knows what else. But anyway, I started writing it at that point. And after that, that was really where it just took off and I started to just investigate what was happening there. And I read a lot of poetry in the years following that. And of course, I tried writing more poetry. And then there was this feedback going on between reading poems that I would then discover to be really, really brilliant and really good, other people's poems, of course. And then that just made me want to write better. And it just kind of kept going after that.
That's awesome. So do you have a favorite poet or anyone that you model your work after?
I try not to model my work after anyone because I want to have my own voice and express things in my own way. But I have many, many poets I admire. I know you're going to ask me a lot of questions about my favorite this or that, which I always find very difficult to answer.
I never can answer them either.
Yeah.
I like to ask them.
But one of the first books I read, so in the final year of my PhD, well, the year before, 1996, was when I started writing up my PhD thesis. That was the year that Wisława Szymborska won the Nobel Prize for Poetry. And so, of course, I was more conscious of that. And I thought, okay, let me read her. And in fact, she's somebody who is kind of known to integrate a little bit of a scientific worldview into her work. So I read the book, her collection of poems that was translated, her most recent one at that time, which was called View with a Grain of Sand. And I was just blown away. And I highly recommend that book to everybody.
Awesome. Well, now you mentioned A View with a Grain of Sand. We've talked about your book a little bit. Are there any other book recommendations that you'd like to put out there for our listeners that I can add to our reading list?
Another book that I do recommend is a book that was published a long time ago, I think in the 50s or 60s. I can't remember exactly. And it's a book by a mathematician named Polya, a Hungarian mathematician. And the book is called How to Solve It. And it's just this little paperback. I think it's published by Princeton University Press. And it's kind of essay-style approach to teaching some basic mathematics and also logic and critical thinking. I was recommended that when I was in grad school, and I just found it a really important, fundamental how to think
Interesting.
kind of book. So that would be my recommendation. Check that out.
That sounds cool. I will definitely add it to our list, How to Solve It, listeners. And Madhur, now we've talked a little bit about your life outside of science, but I want to dive into the science next. We've hinted a little bit about some of your work that you did during your dissertation, but can you give us the high level view now of how you describe your work to someone who has no familiarity with your field?
The funny thing is that I actually introduce myself and describe myself in the same way to scientists or non-scientists. I don't really make that distinction. But then I start quite simple. If someone asks me what I do, I'll say that I'm an ecologist and a professor. And there are always, I would say, actually follow-up questions to that. So what exactly does that mean? What kind of ecology do you do? And then I start to talk about the areas looking at global ecological changes on ecosystems, things ranging from climate change impacts to pollution, to invasive species, land use changes, etc., on biodiversity, ecosystem services, ecosystem functioning, and ecosystem stability. Then people will often get interested in where I work, where are my field sites, and I will then go into the geographic areas. And I do work in Canada, in boreal forest, in temperate forests, in mixed forests. And then I also work through collaborations in many places in the world, but currently most significantly in Brazil and in India. And there I'm looking at mosaics of tropical forest and grassland ecosystems and looking at, again, some of the same drivers and human-induced changes that are going on, especially agriculture in those regions.
You do really fascinating science, and sometimes the science itself can be its own motivation. But I love to chat with scientists about whether they have certain phrases or motivational quotes that really resonate with them and help them through the tough times. So do you have one you could share with us today, Madhur?
I do. I'm not sure why, but there was one phrase that has always kind of stayed with me, and it's the phrase, chance favors the prepared mind, which I believe is attributed to Louis Pasteur after one of his discoveries, which was quite serendipitous. And I think I just like it because it kind of helps me balance the things that I can control and the things that I can't control, and to look at successes and failures in a more humbling and more objective way.
Sure. Well, I think that is a fantastic quote to really highlight that sense of chance and serendipity in science. I think so many people have brought that up in the stories that they've been telling on our program. So I love that quote myself. And now I want to hear about some of the people who you've met in science who've really left a lasting impact on you. So can you tell us about maybe a role model or a mentor or someone who's really made a big difference for you?
I am someone who actually does not look to popular figures or kind of legendary figures, people who are brilliant dead scientists or anything like that as role models. But I know many people do, and there's nothing wrong with that. But for some reason, I've never done that. I've always just looked at who's immediately around me. So I would say from that, the biggest role model and influencer was my first mentor, which was my PhD supervisor. And obviously, he was my first mentor, introducing me to all of the processes around science, discovery, creation, and all that. But he was also someone I admired for personal qualities, for his intellect, but also generosity, a joie de vivre. I loved to see that. Mm-hmm. And also just overall creativity.
That's awesome. I know myself, I'm one of those people, I do have some of these aspirational figures in science that I look up to, but those mentors, I think the people who are working with you hands-on definitely have a big impact on you, and they can really change the course of your career.
Yes.
So can you tell us now where your career in science began? Was there a point in your life where you kind of started getting excited about science that you can recall?
I've always enjoyed science when it was presented to me in courses or even in grade school. I've always enjoyed all aspects of science. But I think it's kind of hard to say where the scientist begins. I think we all begin as scientists.
Mm-hmm. We're all born scientists, yeah.
We are. And as children, we're scientists too. So I was never conscious of it at that point, and there was nothing intervening at that point. But I made a few very conscious decisions a little later on. So in high school, I was encouraged, because I was good at my scientific subjects, I just continued to take lots of different kinds of courses, such that when I graduated from high school, I really did have the option of going into any area at university. But it was my parents who really pushed me, I would say, encouraged me is the nicer way to say it, mm-hmm. to go into science. And so I did make my choice then to start an undergrad in science. And then what I find is that once I start something, I tend to want to see things through to some sort of completion. So I just kind of progressed along the scientific path as one does in university, which means that you specialize. Every year of undergrad results in, at the end of the year, a decision of which direction you're going to go with your specialization. So I kind of went through that filtering process, I would call it. And then in my fourth year, I was in the ecology and evolution program, and I took a couple of courses. One was theoretical ecology, and the other was quantitative ecology. And those two courses really, really caught my imagination, I think I would say. And I felt like I was really able to contribute something unique to. And then that's when I took my first research position. So at the end of that final year, I did a summer undergraduate fellowship in the lab of the person who would then become my mentor for my graduate work. And then that was my first taste of doing research. And that was it. I was hooked after that.
Definitely. Now, you've had some really interesting postdoctoral experiences. You've traveled all over different places. So can you tell us about what led you to these different postdocs and how you transitioned between them and chose the different positions you would take?
Well, in the final year of my doctoral degree, I started to look at possibilities for postdocs and prepared applications. So at that point already, I was trying to find labs that I might want to work in. I was also getting advice from my mentor. And one of the best pieces of advice I think he gave me at that point of my career was to really think outside of North America for my postdoctoral work, which is not something that would have naturally come to me because I was born and raised in Canada. My family's all here. Everything that I know of science was largely North American. All the reasons why some might think it's just the right thing to leave.
Right. You stay where it's comfortable, right?
Yeah. I think I would have just stayed, maybe gone to the US, but nothing further afield than that. But he really encouraged me to go overseas somewhere. So I applied for an NSERC postdoctoral fellowship. NSERC is our Natural Science and Engineering Research Council of Canada, which all scientists, we love. And they provide fellowships for postdocs, which are really great because they allow you to go anywhere you want if you are successful. And then I proposed Italy, Trieste, for that, which is a place where there is surprisingly a lot of international institutions. So there was the International Center for Science, which was a United Nations entity there, a research institute. And also there was an International Center for Theoretical Physics there that was doing really neat things at the cutting edge of theoretical ecology. So I thought that would be a good place to spend some time. So I suggested that. And then I also at the same time applied. There was an opportunity from the government of Israel for Canadians to go over. And I also applied for one of their fellowships, a Lady Davis Fellowship. And I ended up getting both.
Oh, wow.
So that's what kind of allowed me to play around, I guess, with my locations. And then basically I accepted the Lady Davis Fellowship. I accepted the NSERC Fellowship as well. And I kind of did them in sequence. So I went to Italy for a while, and then I went to Israel for a year. And then after that, I still had funds from my NSERC Fellowship. I could go on. There's a lot of reasons for the rest of the trajectory, but one of them was to actually go to the Netherlands, to go to the research sites of a data set that I had worked with in my PhD, because I ended up making contact with the researcher who had collected that data. And he was quite old. This was a several decades data set, but he was still alive. So I wanted to go and visit those sites with him. And he had some additional data in his archives that I was going to work with. And then New Mexico, I was attracted to that part of the world because there was a lot of work around biocomplexity happening in the States at that time. Mm-hmm. And the Santa Fe Institute, which is very close to Albuquerque, is world renowned for work in that area, which is the area that I was very passionate about and still am, complex systems science.
Very cool. Well, wonderful to hear a little bit more about your journey, Madhur. And now we mentioned that you are a faculty member now at the University of Guelph. Can you tell us about one of the projects that you have ongoing right now that you are just the most excited to be working on?
Again, it's one of those, what's your favorite thing? Because in my lab, we really do have a very diverse set of projects, all with a kind of broader common goal, but every graduate student is kind of working on something different. Mm-hmm. But I would say that there is a set of projects that's a little more recent, and it's a more recent direction, which is looking at coupling ecological dynamics and our models of ecological dynamics, which has to do with things like how biodiversity changes or how forest cover changes over time in response to climate change or fire, or just sort of basic ecological processes. But coupling those dynamics with dynamics of human behavior and decision making. So we have a number of projects right now looking at that coupling, because in the past, ecologists have kind of considered humans only from the perspective of what is the impact humans have on ecosystems. And it's usually a negative impact, and go in and try to assess that impact. But we are just beginning to realize that actually the biggest thing to look at is how to close that loop and how to reverse some of those trajectories. And so we're actually trying to couple human behavior to some ecological dynamics.
Well, I think this decision-making angle is really interesting, and I've never really thought about ecology from that perspective, so that's very cool. So now tell us a little bit more about some of the challenges that you face in your work. I think we've thus far made your journey in your work sound like a grand adventure in science, but I think every scientist has dark days, and I think it's important to talk about those so maybe students or postdocs who are going through them right now realize they're not alone and that they can go on to be successful. So can you share one of your challenges with us, Madhur, and talk about how you got through it?
Yes, I just want to preface that by saying that relatively speaking, I feel that life has been not as challenging for me as I think it is for the average citizen on the globe. Mm-hmm. I just want to acknowledge that at the outset, so that I think living in Canada, growing up in Canada, having access to free and good education and all of these things are things that I don't like to take for granted.
Right. Helps put your challenges in perspective, I think. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, having said that, of course, there's things that go along. And I would say probably that the biggest thing that takes some getting used to is rejection. Mm-hmm. And that can come from many places and in many forms. So for some people, and for me, for example, one of the first types of rejection that I found difficult to deal with is when your papers are rejected from scientific journals. Now, it happened such a long time ago that right now, when I even talk about that and say that, I've become so resilient.
It doesn't seem as painful now. Yeah.
No, not at all. But I'm trying to imagine, and I'm trying to put myself back in those days of, God, you think something is so great, and then you'll get these responses telling you otherwise, right? And that happens in science. That also happens in poetry, of course. So it happens in everything. Mm-hmm. And then that rejection can come from other places too. You apply for jobs, you don't get them. And just because everything is so competitive, and the further you go along, the more competitive it is, I think the sooner you can kind of deal with rejection and take it with a grain of salt, maybe use that saying, chance favors the prepared mind, and just keep going and doing the best you can will help towards just letting all that stuff disappear.
Absolutely. So Madhur, do you have any maybe tried and true strategies that you can suggest for our listeners, or things kind of looking back that helped you steel yourself for these rejections that you were coming across?
I don't have any secrets. There is a phase for sure that you're just going to be totally upset and grieve. But I think you just have to stay as objective as possible and as determined as possible, and believe in your work, and honestly take the criticism as a positive thing. It's a little bit hard, like it's a little bit of a bitter pill sometimes to swallow, but over time, you get better actually at determining which criticism is constructive and which is non-constructive. And once you're able to do that, wow, I think that is really a great thing going forward.
Well, I think you brought up a great point there. And I know myself as a graduate student thinking back, when I submitted those papers and got those criticisms and rejections back, it was a blow and it was really hard to recover from. But now that I'm on the other side of it, reviewing papers myself, if it's not worth my time, I'm just going to reject it and not provide a ton of feedback. But if I'm taking the time to make a page or two of actual constructive criticism, that's because I know it has potential. So now I take that criticism as a compliment. So
yes, absolutely.
Well, definitely. Thank you for sharing one of these challenges that you face in your career. But we don't just want to talk about the downside of life as a scientist. So, Madhur, can you tell us about one of your success stories, one of these high moments you really were excited about?
Again, I have to say that success is a relative thing and sometimes very difficult to really measure. I think that we think we know what success means in life and in science. And of course, awards and publications and grants and all that are ways in which we can assess success. And of course, all those things are important and make me happy. But I think one of the things most recently that I consider a success as a prof and in general is seeing my own students able to fulfill their potential. Because I think a failure, speaking of failures, just going back to your past question, it really is heartbreaking and sad for me to see when a student is not fulfilling their potential for reasons beyond my control. And so when students do excel and go on, I love to see that kind of success. So most recently, one of my PhD students did get a tenure track faculty position in the States, and it's really hard to do that right now. So I'm really happy about that.
Well, congratulations to both you and your student. I know that is a big success. And I love this point that you brought up of being able to help and mentor this next generation of students. So can you talk a little bit about your role as a mentor and what that brings to your career?
I don't really feel ever like that I'm consciously mentoring. I've had in the past, there's been attempts of people assigning mentors and so on, but I think we all find, like including my own students who work with me and when I worked with other people, everybody finds a different benefit from that mentorship relationship. And so for me, it's very individualistic. I don't have like
your recipe for mentoring a student. Yeah.
I don't have a booklet saying this is what I'm going to do to mentor you. Although there are some commonalities, but generally speaking, it really depends on the student and whether it is just providing them with what they need to pursue their research interests, giving them feedback, giving them academic feedback, sometimes even personal feedback, providing opportunities, including them in events where they can meet other scientists and peers and make connections. One thing that I do like to encourage in all my students is to get some international experience because of my positive experience with that. So I really love taking students with me to do field work or to go to conferences or workshops or meetings for my various grants in international places or send them on their own if that's possible. So I'd like to kind of pass that on.
Definitely. Now, speaking of travel and some of these international experiences that you like to promote, can you tell us about an experience of yours or maybe a place that is just really stand out in your mind of a place that you've been that you loved and is one of your favorite travel places? I know I'm asking for a favorite again.
Yeah. Well, I think I would have to say that the most sort of impactful one for me was that postdoctoral visit to Israel because I did not really know what I was getting myself into. I did not know much about the country at that time. And my decision decision to go there wasn't very premeditated. I mean, I got the fellowship, which basically said, go there. And
right.
So I didn't want to pass up that opportunity. And it was a fascinating country to be exposed to at that early age because of its cultural significance and diversity in terms of natural landscapes and also history. It was the first time that I did field work in a desert, which was really another kind of big change in perspective versus my experience that I'd had previously, which is of Northern Ontario and forests and lakes and so on. So it was really fascinating to go from that scale to the scale of research in a desert where you're on your hands and knees looking at the extremely diverse annual plant community that comes up out of the soil for a very brief period of time.
Right.
So yeah, from kind of lush landscapes to that extreme and so on. So it was quite eye-opening in many aspects.
Certainly. So are there things that you remember maybe seeing or doing while you were in Israel for this period that really stuck in your mind?
All of the religious icons, the Western Wall, and gosh, I'm not going to remember all the names of everything, but you can walk through places mentioned in the Bible. Not that I'm religious or anything, but it was so fascinating to see all of that. But in addition, what I found really, I think that had a bit of an impact on me was that the things that we were hearing in the news, it kind of opened my eyes up to how things can be sensationalized. And some members of my own family were telling me not to go to Israel and spend my postdoctoral time there because of things that were happening in the news and in the past. But I actually felt when I lived there, it was extremely safe. So these biases that kind of just learning and experiencing how our perception of things can be quite different from reality.
Certainly. Well, I think this is a wonderful experience to share with our listeners. And I love how you encourage your own students to pursue some of these international experiences and provide them with opportunities to travel with you to conferences. I think that's phenomenal. And now we've talked about some of the students that you've encountered over the years, people that you've worked with, mentors that you've had. And I think the people are a huge part of what makes science great. And one of the things that I love to talk about are some of the quirky things that happen when you work together, fun traditions that you establish. So Madhur, do you have a story that you can share with us today that really encapsulates that human side of science?
Well, I was thinking about quirky things that I've encountered in science. And one of them, I mean, it's the norm where it is, but for me, it was quirky, was when I first went to Brazil and I went on, even just in the labs or going on field trips with groups there, they have a tradition of drinking mate tea. Mm-hmm. Mate is just a type of herbal tea, but they drink it, I would say, kind of like we drink coffee, but there's a different ritual to how you drink it. And so there's the kind of cup that you drink it out of is this, I think it's a wooden vessel. I'm not sure exactly what it's made of, but it's a vessel. And then there's a metal straw, and people will carry around hot water in thermoses and then make the tea in that and then drink it. But what is a little bit quirky for me was that that vessel is then passed around to everybody in the group to drink from the same straw.
Ah, gotcha.
Yeah.
The germaphobe in me is cringing.
Well, there's probably some explanation to that. I won't go into that here. But so I remember sort of being past it and then, well, taking a sip. And that happens in the lab, that happens in the field. But it also struck me as something that was kind of a very social type of ritual that I thought was really interesting.
I like it. And I think it's some of these maybe things that are just small cultural things that you experience when you go to a new place that really stand out in your mind. And I think fantastic story. So now you mentioned this mate tea. Are you a tea drinker yourself?
Yes, I am. And a coffee drinker too.
Ah, do you have a favorite kind of tea?
Yeah, I like my chai tea.
I'm a chai fan myself. So excellent choice. And now we've talked a little bit about your life outside of science and some of the work that you've been doing over the course of your career. And I think talking about these big research questions is so much fun. But I love to give scientists the opportunity to dream even bigger. So Madhur, I want you to dream big with us today. If we gave you everything, if things like funding, staff, technology, feasibility were not a problem, there were no barriers, is there one question in your mind that you are just dying to know the answer to?
Well, I think it would be really cool to track in real time invasive species or non-native species, perhaps at the edge of becoming invasive, or just the migration of species in general. That would be really cool. And like all of them, all in real time.
That would be cool.
Including perhaps species that are migrating due to climate change, because we always study those things a bit after the fact, right? In ecology, and the data is always limiting, and we can't do it everywhere, and we can't do it simultaneously, and so on. So I think it'd be really cool if we could see all of that in real time. Perhaps that would change how we are as a society responding to those things and dealing with those things. Because we're, as ecologists, always trying to develop early warning signals, but it would be really cool if we could just actually see them.
Absolutely.
And know them through some sort of technology and lots of field work going on all at the same time. This is not feasible, I know, but feasibility was not a criteria.
That's right. You had freedom of thought here.
Yeah. So those are just things in ecology, but everything that we do is because of those limits, right? So all of our modeling is because we don't have scenarios and cases and data, and we can't perform those experiments. So that would be kind of cool from an ecological perspective. But in general, if nothing was an issue and if we could really solve it, I would love to see advances in every other field. And so it would be great to have a cure for cancer, and it would be great to have more discoveries on making other planets habitable.
I like it. Well, I think these are some of the big questions that keep all of us awake at night. And I really like this idea of studying real time these invasive and non-native species. So is there one particular region, say we gave you everything and you could actually do this project, is there one region that you would be interested in starting this project in?
Yeah, well, in Brazil, that's where I'm working. And we've just actually detected a few, they're cosmopolitan invasive species, but they're new to that continent. And so why not start with Brazil?
Very cool. Well, I like it, Madhur. Again, thanks for thinking big with us. And thank you for chatting about all of your experiences in life and science. And I've given you a couple opportunities throughout our interview to share advice with our listeners, but I think this is really helpful for them as they go along their scientific journey. So is there one piece of advice that sticks out in your mind as maybe the best advice you ever received that you can now pay forward?
Well, I've already talked about the international experience. And for me, that's not just going, do as much as you can, but it's one thing to just kind of travel for 2 weeks to a conference or even as a tourist, but it's another thing to actually go and work in a university or in a scientific institution in another country, because then you really see things in perspective, good and bad. I think a lot of things can change. I was often amazed working in labs and visiting labs in China and India and in Israel and in Brazil at how much is being done with so much less of the resources that we often have here in North America. So it's quite humbling and just changes one's perspective.
Certainly. Well, I think that is great advice to pass on to our listeners. Is there any other note of inspiration you want to end on, or any last piece of advice that you want to share with them today?
I guess because I am also very active in the arts, and it is something I'm very passionate about, both science and arts as means of discovering the world, I would have to say, if you are someone who thinks that those are mutually exclusive things and that's maybe preventing you from doing one or the other, to really look out there, and because there are quite, not a lot, but there are a few people doing both, and just keep your options open. Certainly.
So is it difficult for you to balance both the scientific side and the poetry world?
It is. It is difficult, but it's also extremely, extremely rewarding.
Fantastic. Well, Madhur, thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us today. Can you tell our listeners where they can go or how they can contact you if they want to learn more?
Yes, they can follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Global Eco Change. I'm not very active on Twitter, but I'm getting there, and that would be a good place to connect. But I guess if you want to have kind of a more meaningful conversation with me, really the best way is to send me an email introducing yourself and what it is you'd like to talk about, anand.madhur@gmail.com.
Perfect. Well, listeners, definitely follow Madhur on Twitter. Email her with any questions that you may have. And Madhur, thank you again so much for your time today.
You're more than welcome. Thank you very much.
Well, it was a pleasure to chat with you. And listeners, thank you all for joining us today as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to explore the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to chatting with you next time on People Behind the Science.